Imagine checking on your loved one's grave only to find an empty hole where their body should be. The headstone still stands, but 6 feet below, nothing remains but disturbed earth and splintered wood. This nightmare became reality for dozens of families in 1874 Arkansas, thanks to one man's twisted hunger for profit. His name was Barrow. By day, he was the town's trusted gravedigger. By night, he became something far more sinister. A body snatcher who fed fresh corpses to the growing appetite of American medical schools. But Barrow's crimes went deeper than simple grave robbing. He didn't just steal bodies. He carved them up, selling skulls to the highest bidder while leaving families to mourn over empty graves. This is the true story of America's most evil gravedigger, and how one man's greed turned a quiet Arkansas cemetery into a horror show that would haunt the medical world forever. In the spring of 1874, the small town of Pine Bluff, Arkansas, seemed like any other growing settlement along the Arkansas River. Cotton fields stretched toward the horizon, riverboats carried goods up and down the muddy waters, and life moved at the steady pace of the post-Civil War South. The war had ended 9 years earlier, but its scars still marked the landscape and the people who called Pine Bluff home. Among these residents was Barrow, a man in his early 40s with calloused hands and a reputation for hard work. Barrow had arrived in Pine Bluff sometime in the late 1860s, claiming to be a former Union soldier looking for a fresh start. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that always seemed slightly unkempt, and eyes that neighbors later described as cold as winter stone. But in 1874, those same neighbors saw him as nothing more than the town's dependable gravedigger. Barrow had secured his position at Riverside Cemetery through a combination of necessity and opportunity. The previous gravedigger had died of consumption the winter before, and few men were eager to take on the grim work of burying the dead. But Barrow seemed different. He approached the job with an almost unsettling enthusiasm, volunteering to work longer hours and take on additional responsibilities that others avoided. He was always willing to work, remembered Sarah Mitchell, whose husband served on the cemetery board. Even in the worst weather, Mr. Barrow would be out there tending to the graves. We thought we were lucky to have found such a dedicated man. What the good people of Pine Bluff didn't know was that Barrow's dedication had nothing to do with respect for the dead. It had everything to do with the growing demand for human specimens in America's expanding medical schools. The 1870s marked a turning point in American medicine. Medical schools were opening across the country, and each one needed cadavers for dissection and study. But there was a problem. Legal sources of bodies were extremely limited. Most states restricted the use of unclaimed bodies from prisons and poorhouses, and religious beliefs made body donation nearly unthinkable for most families. This created a lucrative black market for what the medical community euphemistically called anatomical specimens. A fresh body could bring anywhere from $50 to $100, more money than most working men saw in 6 months. For someone like Barrow, who knew exactly where to find fresh bodies and had unlimited access to them, it was an opportunity too profitable to ignore. But Barrow's operation was more calculated than typical grave robbing. Most body snatchers worked quickly, stealing entire corpses under cover of darkness. Barrow developed a different approach, one that would allow him to maximize profits while minimizing the risk of discovery. He began by studying the cemetery's burial patterns. He noted which families visited graves regularly and which plots were rarely disturbed. He paid attention to funeral attendants, identifying bodies that belonged to people with few local connections. Most importantly, he learned to read the subtle signs of wealth and poverty that determined how much attention a grave might receive. Poor families, recent immigrants, and transients became Barrow's primary targets. Their graves were less likely to be visited, and if discovered disturbed, the authorities were less likely to investigate thoroughly. It was a cold calculation that revealed the depth of Barrow's moral corruption. The actual theft began in late 1873, but it wasn't until the following spring that Barrow's true genius for evil became apparent. Rather than stealing entire bodies, he developed a system for harvesting the most valuable parts while leaving enough behind to maintain the illusion that graves remained undisturbed. Skulls were in particular high demand. Medical students needed them to study brain anatomy, and quality specimens could bring premium prices. Barrow learned to remove skulls cleanly, often replacing them with rocks or wooden blocks to maintain the proper weight and shape when the coffin was moved. Hands and feet were also valuable for studying bone structure, and Barrow became skilled at removing them without damaging the valuable specimens.
The rest of the body would be reburied, usually in a shallower grave, or sometimes mixed with the remains of other corpses to save space. From the surface, the graves appeared normal. Only someone digging down would discover the horrible truth. Barrow's customers were primarily medical schools in Little Rock, Memphis, and St. Louis. He established contact through a network of middlemen who asked no questions as long as the specimens were fresh and properly preserved. The transactions usually took place at night in remote locations along the Arkansas River, where riverboats could discreetly load cargo. He had it down to a science, explained Dr. Marcus Webb, a historian who studied body snatching in the post-Civil War period. Barrow wasn't just a grave robber. He was running a sophisticated supply operation that could deliver specific anatomical parts on demand. By the summer of 1874, Barrow was processing an average of 3 to 4 bodies per month. He had constructed a crude but effective workshop in his barn, complete with tools for dissection and preservation. Neighbors occasionally noticed strange smells coming from his property, but Barrow explained them away as part of his work preparing bodies for burial. The operation might have continued indefinitely if not for a stroke of bad luck and a mother's love. Mrs. Catherine O'Brien had lost her youngest son, Michael, to scarlet fever in June 1874. The boy was only 7 years old, and his death had devastated the Irish immigrant family. Unlike many of the poor families that Barrow typically targeted, the O'Briens had scraped together enough money for a proper headstone and planned to visit the grave regularly. 3 weeks after the funeral, Mrs. O'Brien made her first visit to Michael's grave. She brought wildflowers picked from along the riverbank and knelt beside the small headstone to pray. But something felt wrong. The soil looked different, looser and darker than she remembered. More troubling, there was a slight depression in the ground, as if the earth had settled unevenly. Mrs. O'Brien's concerns might have been dismissed as grief-induced paranoia, but she had the support of Father Patrick McManus, the priest who had performed Michael's funeral. Father McManus had noticed similar irregularities at other recent grave sites, though he had hesitated to voice his suspicions. "He came to me in tears," Father McManus later testified. "She said something was wrong with her boy's grave, that it didn't look right. I had seen the same things at other sites, but I didn't want to add to the family's grief by suggesting something so horrible." Together, Mrs. O'Brien and Father Patrick McManus approached the cemetery board with their concerns. The board members were initially skeptical. The idea that someone would disturb the dead seemed unthinkable in their quiet community. But the priest's reputation and Mrs. O'Brien's obvious distress convinced them to investigate. On July 15, 1874, a small group, including Mrs. O'Brien, Father McManus, and 3 cemetery board members, gathered at Michael O'Brien's grave. They had brought shovels and lanterns, though they all hoped their suspicions would prove unfounded. The truth was far worse than anyone had imagined. Michael's small coffin was still in place, but when they opened it, they found only a headless torso. The child's skull, hands, and feet had been cleanly removed. In place of the head was a smooth river stone, roughly the same size and weight as a 7-year-old skull. Mrs. O'Brien's screams echoed across the cemetery as the full horror of the discovery became clear. Her son, her baby, had been butchered like livestock and sold piece by piece to strangers who would never know his name or care about the family that mourned him. News of the discovery spread through Pine Bluff like wildfire. By the next morning, dozens of families were demanding that their loved ones' graves be examined. What they found defied comprehension. Of the 47 graves examined over the next 3 days, 31 showed signs of disturbance. Bodies were missing heads, limbs, or had been replaced entirely with animal bones or wooden blocks. Some graves contained the mixed remains of multiple people, suggesting that Barrow had been using burial sites as disposal areas for the parts he couldn't sell. The pattern of victims revealed the calculated nature of Barrow's crimes. Almost without exception, the disturbed graves belonged to the poor, the friendless, or recent arrivals to the community. Children were particularly targeted, as their smaller skulls were easier to transport and often in high demand for pediatric medical studies. As news of the grave robbing spread, attention naturally turned to Ephraim Barrow. As the cemetery's gravedigger, he had unlimited access to burial sites and would know exactly when and where bodies were interred. More damning, several townspeople now remembered odd details that seemed insignificant at the time. Tom Wilson, who lived near Barrow's property, recalled seeing mysterious wagons arriving at night. He said, "I thought it was odd that he'd have visitors at such late hours." But he said he sometimes had to prepare bodies for burial at night when families wanted early morning services.
Mary Henderson, who had hired Barrow to dig her husband's grave, remembered how interested he had seemed in details about the family's financial situation and whether they had relatives in the area. He asked a lot of questions that seemed strange at the time, she testified, but I thought he was just being thorough about his work. Most disturbing was the testimony of young Jacob Miller, who had sometimes helped Barrow with his regular duties. Jacob described seeing human bones and skulls in Barrow's barn, along with chemicals and tools that had nothing to do with grave digging. He told me they were old bones he'd found when digging graves, Jacob explained. Said he was cleaning them up to bury them properly. But now I think they were fresh bones from people who were supposed to be resting in peace. On July 20th, 1874, Sheriff Thomas Garrett arrived at Barrow's property with a warrant for his arrest. What they found in his barn confirmed their worst fears and added new horrors to an already unthinkable crime. The barn had been converted into a makeshift dissection facility. Tables were stained with blood and other fluids, and the air was thick with the smell of death and preservation chemicals. Most shocking was an inventory of human remains that Barrow had apparently been preparing for shipment. Investigators found 14 human skulls in various stages of cleaning and preparation. Some had been treated with chemicals to preserve them, while others were still being processed. There were also numerous hands, feet, and other body parts stored in wooden crates and metal containers.
Perhaps most disturbing was a ledger that detailed Barrow's transactions. Written in his careful handwriting were records of sales dating back more than a year. Skulls brought between $8 and $15 each, depending on condition and age. Complete sets of hands and feet sold for $5 to $10. The ledger showed that Barrow had made more than $800 from his ghoulish trade, a fortune by 1874 standards. When confronted with the evidence, Barrow initially tried to claim that he was simply cleaning bones that he had found while digging graves. But the fresh condition of many specimens and the detailed sales records made this explanation impossible to believe. The man showed no remorse whatsoever, Sheriff Garrett later wrote in his report. Even when confronted with the skull of little Michael O'Brien, he seemed more concerned about the loss of his inventory than the grief he had caused. "I have arrested criminals in my career, but I have never encountered such cold indifference to human suffering." Barrow's arrest sent shockwaves through the medical community as well. The scandal exposed the dark reality of how many medical schools obtained the specimens they needed for teaching. While body snatching was an open secret in the profession, few had considered the human cost of their willful ignorance about where specimens originated. Dr. Harrison Mitchell of the Little Rock Medical College, which had been one of Barrow's customers, issued a statement expressing profound regret about the situation. "We relied on our suppliers to obtain specimens through legal and ethical means," he claimed. "The discovery that we may have unknowingly participated in such heinous crimes fills us with horror." But critics pointed out that medical schools rarely asked questions about the source of their specimens, and the prices they paid made it almost certain that the bodies were obtained illegally. The Barrow case forced an uncomfortable reckoning with the medical profession's complicity in the body trade. The trial of Ephraim Barrow began on September 14, 1874, in the courthouse at Pine Bluff. The prosecution, led by District Attorney William Hayes, faced the challenge of convicting a man for crimes that had no clear precedent in Arkansas law. While grave robbing was illegal, the specific nature of Barrow's crimes, the systematic harvesting and sale of body parts, fell into a legal gray area. The prosecution strategy focused on charges of theft and desecration of corpses, arguing that Barrow had stolen property belonging to the families of the deceased. They brought in expert witnesses to testify about the systematic nature of his operation and called dozens of family members to describe the emotional damage caused by his crimes. Mrs. Catherine O'Brien's testimony was particularly powerful. She described the agony of discovering her son's mutilated remains and the ongoing nightmares that plagued her sleep. "He didn't just steal my boy's body," he told the court through tears. "He stole my peace, my faith, my ability to believe that death brings rest. Every night I wonder where pieces of my Michael are now and whether I'll ever be able to give him a proper burial." The defense, led by lawyer Samuel Crawford, attempted to argue that Barrow's actions, while disturbing, served a greater good by advancing medical knowledge. They brought in medical experts who testified about the importance of anatomical study and the shortage of legal specimens available to medical schools.
"My client may have used questionable methods," Crawford argued, "but his work contributed to the advancement of medical science that will ultimately save countless lives. We must consider whether the greater good justifies actions that might seem distasteful to individual sensibilities." This argument backfired spectacularly with the jury, which was composed primarily of local farmers and merchants who had been personally affected by Barrow's crimes. The suggestion that their loved ones' bodies were somehow expendable for the sake of medical progress only deepened their anger and revulsion. The turning point in the trial came when prosecutors presented evidence from Barrow's ledger showing that he had specifically targeted the graves of children and the poor. This contradicted the defense's claim that Barrow was motivated by scientific advancement rather than pure profit. If Mr. Barrow truly cared about medical progress, prosecutor Hayes argued, why did he focus on the graves of those least able to defend themselves?
Why did he target children whose small skulls brought premium prices rather than seeking legal sources of specimens? This was not science. This was predatory capitalism at its most evil. The trial lasted 6 days. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Judge William Porter sentenced Barrow to 15 years in the state penitentiary, calling his crimes an affront to human dignity and the sacred trust we place in those who care for our dead. But the story didn't end with Barrow's conviction. The discovery of his crimes had exposed a much larger network of body snatchers, corrupt medical suppliers, and complicit institutions. Investigations in other states revealed similar operations, and public outrage led to significant changes in how medical schools obtained specimens for study. Several states passed new laws specifically targeting body snatching and requiring medical schools to document the legal source of all specimens. The Uniform Anatomical Gift Act, which allowed people to donate their bodies to science, was partly a response to scandals like the Barrow case. But for the families of Pine Bluff, legal reforms provided little comfort. Many of the stolen remains were never recovered, leaving families uncertain about what had happened to their loved ones' bodies. Some graves had to be left empty, with families holding memorial services for people whose physical remains might be scattered across medical schools in multiple states. The emotional scars ran even deeper. The violation of the graves shattered the community's sense of security and trust. Death, which had always been viewed as a peaceful end to earthly struggles, now carried the fear that even the grave might not provide safety from those who would exploit human suffering for profit. Mrs. Catherine O'Brien never fully recovered from the trauma of discovering her son's mutilated remains. She moved away from Pine Bluff within a year of the trial, telling neighbors that she could no longer bear to live in a place where such evil had been allowed to flourish. She died in 1889, and according to her surviving relatives, she never spoke about Michael's death after leaving Arkansas. What happened here doesn't really belong just to history books. Drop a comment below and let me know what state you're watching from, because stories like this happened everywhere across America during this dark period of medical history. Ephraim Barrow served 12 years of his 15-year sentence before being released on parole in 1886. Prison records showed that he was considered a model prisoner, working in the prison carpentry shop and causing no disciplinary problems. But those who knew him said he never expressed any remorse for his crimes or acknowledged the pain he had caused to the families of his victims. After his release, Barrow disappeared from public records. Some sources suggest he moved west, possibly to California, where the growing population and loose social connections would have made it easier for someone with his past to start over. Others believe he may have continued his body-snatching activities under a different name, as similar crimes were reported in several Western states during the late 1880s and early 1990s. The medical schools that had purchased specimens from Barrow faced their own reckoning. Several institutions were forced to destroy their anatomical collections and start over with legally obtained specimens. The scandal damaged the reputation of American medical education and led to increased scrutiny of how teaching hospitals and medical schools conducted their research. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Barrow case was its effect on how Americans viewed death and burial. The idea that graves could be violated for profit shattered assumptions about the sanctity of burial grounds and forced families to take new precautions to protect their loved ones' remains. Some families began purchasing expensive metal caskets that would be harder to open. Others arranged for private guards to watch over fresh graves until decomposition made body snatching unprofitable. Wealthy families sometimes built elaborate tomb structures designed to prevent unauthorized access to remains.
These precautions highlighted the dark reality that in 1870s America, even death could not guarantee peace for those without the resources to protect themselves. The poor and powerless remained vulnerable to exploitation even after they had been laid to rest. The Riverside Cemetery in Pine Bluff still exists today,
though it has been expanded and modernized over the decades. A small memorial marker, installed in 1924 on the 50th anniversary of the scandal, acknowledges the victims of what local historians call the grave-robbing horror. The marker doesn't mention Ephraim Barrow by name, referring only to those whose rest was disturbed by greed and those who mourn them still. But visitors who know the history can still see evidence of the scandal's impact. Many of the graves from the 1870s are surrounded by elaborate iron fencing or covered with heavy stone slabs, precautions taken by families who feared that death might not be enough to protect their loved ones from those who would profit from human suffering. The story of Ephraim Barrow forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about progress and its costs. The medical advances that emerged from anatomical study in the late 1800s undoubtedly saved countless lives and reduced human suffering. Modern surgery, our understanding of disease, and many medical treatments we take for granted today were built on knowledge gained from the dissection of human remains. But at what cost? How many families, like the O'Briens, suffered unimaginable trauma so that medical students could study anatomy? How many graves were violated? How many communities traumatized? How much trust shattered in the name of scientific progress? These questions become even more troubling when we consider who bore the costs of medical advancement. Barrow's victims were overwhelmingly poor, powerless, and marginalized, people whose deaths were seen as less significant than the needs of medical education. The bodies of the wealthy and well-connected remained safely buried, while the poor were harvested like crops to feed the appetite of American medicine. This pattern of exploitation didn't end with the body snatchers of the 1870s. Throughout American history, medical research has repeatedly targeted vulnerable populations, poor communities, racial minorities, prisoners, and others who lacked the power to refuse or demand ethical treatment. The Barrow case was just an early example of how the pursuit of medical knowledge could become a form of violence against those least able to defend themselves. Today, medical schools obtain their teaching specimens through legal donation programs, and strict ethical guidelines govern medical research involving human subjects. But the questions raised by the Barrow case remain relevant. How do we balance the benefits of medical progress against the rights and dignity of individuals? Who bears the costs of scientific advancement, and who reaps the benefits? As you think about this story, remember that it's not just about one evil man who violated graves for profit. It's about a system that created demand for stolen bodies, institutions that asked no questions about where specimens came from, and a society that valued medical progress more than the dignity of the dead. The empty graves of Pine Bluff remind us that progress always comes at a cost. The question we must continue to ask ourselves is whether we're willing to pay that cost, and more importantly, whether we're the ones being asked to pay it. What do you think? Was medical progress worth the trauma inflicted on families like the O'Briens? Should the ends ever justify such horrific means? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story opened your eyes to a dark chapter of medical history you never knew existed, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because there are countless more stories like this buried in the shadows of America's past, waiting to be uncovered.